Greetings, humans of the internet, and welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as usual, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historical insights. And as I am still riding high on the amount of joy I received from last week's episode, and by the way, Mr. Wright will be again here next week, hopefully, if everything goes according to plan, as I hope it will. But I figured it would be a good time to discuss the history of vaudeville in America, because both Mr. Wright and myself are highly interested in that facet of entertainment. So please sit back and enjoy the ride as we dive into the history of American vaudeville. Now, before we can dive into the history of vaudeville, we must first ask ourselves, well, what is vaudeville? Well, at least in the United States, it connotes a light entertainment popular from the mid-1890s to about the early 1930s that consisted of 10 to 15 individual unrelated acts featuring magicians, acrobats, comedians, trained jugglers, singers, and dancers, and trained animals. Now, the origins of vaudeville, as with most things, are somewhat obscure. Some scholars have pinpointed the location of the birthplace of vaudeville as France. And the word vaudeville itself is thought to have been derived from Vaudville, which is a river valley in Normandy, which in turn was home to the 15th century poet Oliver Basselin. He wrote popular songs, somebody called them drinking songs, which he named Chansons du Vaudeville, after his hometown. At agricultural fairs around the close of the 17th century, these songs, which were refreshed with topical lyrics, were put together with sketches and called vaudevilles. Get it? Vaudeville, Vaudeville. However, this style of variety entertainment would not enter the United States until the 1850s. It became popular among frontier settlements and urban centers. These shows were geared toward all-male audiences and were often obscenely comical. These shows were often done in saloons. This would change when a former circus performer turned theater manager named Tony Pastor decided to appeal to middle-class Americans and cleaned up these variety shows. In 1865, Pastor opened his opera house that showed clean variety acts and catered to repeat customers. By 1875, he opened a theater at 585 Broadway in New York, where many people got their start. And other theater managers soon followed suit when they recognized that a wider audience appeal might bring in more money and followed Pastor's lead. With an influx of recent immigrants and quickly growing urban populations, vaudeville soon became a central point of American cultural life. One such theater owner was a man named Benjamin Franklin Keith, who made his name in American vaudeville after he opened the Bijou Theater in Boston, Massachusetts. He enacted a policy that forbade vulgarity and coarse materials in his acts in order to appeal to women and children, and he censored performers who did not meet his standards. And by the 1890s, more theater managers followed Keith's lead, and theater circuits and networks of booking offices sprung around the country. Keith and his partner Edward F. Albee created a monopoly of the business through the United Booking Artists, and later through the Vaudeville Managers Association. Keith also came up with the idea of continuous performances, which could last up to half a day, and acts would appear 2 or 3 times. This catered to audiences that either had a lot of leisure time or constrained by shift work, and it gave the illusion that theaters were thriving and always ready to delight people. These new theaters would try to outdo each other by grandeur as well. With marble interiors, upholstered furniture, massive paintings, gilded arches, and floral displays. B.F. Keith also made sure his patrons knew how to behave, asking women to remove their hats, or men not to smoke in the theaters, or stamp their feet, or stomp their canes on the floor. Patrons who did not follow ushers' instructions would be removed from the theater. These impressive theaters and the clean shows inside them were meant to bring refinement to variety shows and separate vaudeville from more risque forms of entertainment like burlesque, which was meant mostly for men, and sketches would be broken up by chorus girls and strippers. The Palace Theater in New York became the premier vaudeville theater in the country in the early 20th century, and everyone wanted to perform there. And this now gives us a chance to discuss some of the acts and people who were in vaudeville. These included one of my personal favorite comedians, W.C. Fields, who was originally a juggler, Will Rogers, the famous cowboy comic, and of course George Burns and Gracie Allen, just to name a few people. Vaudeville developed into a big business. By the end of the 19th century, the era of the vaudeville chain, a group of houses controlled by a single manager, was firmly established. The largest chains were the United Booking Office, with over 400 theaters in the East and Midwest, and Martin Beck's Orpheum Circuit, which controlled theaters from Chicago to California. Beck also built the Palace Theater in New York, which from 1913 to 1932 was the outstanding vaudeville house in the United States. Vaudeville was powered by the increasing number of white-collar workers and increased spending power and leisure time of the middle class. New technologies like railroads, telegraphs, and telephones, as well as the press and bankers of the time, helped to make vaudeville a booming success. Show business, at least as we know it now, had arrived. And to keep the people coming in, acts were arranged strategically for each show. The first act of a vaudeville show was usually a silent act that did not require close attention to make time for late patrons to enter the theater. The second act was usually something boring. The third act could be a short play. The fourth act was something engaging to wake the audience up like slapstick comedy. And the fifth was where featured stars were placed before intermission. The sixth act was a big production. The seventh and eighth followed in more or less the same trend. And the ninth act, or second to last, was saved for the best act of the night and was where every performer wanted to be placed. The last act was a bad act, meant to get the first audience out of the theater to make way for the new one. And interestingly, many of these acts were family acts. For many of these families, the traveling lifestyle was simply a continuation of the adventures that brought them to America. Their acts were a form of assimilation, in which they could become active parts of popular culture through representation of their heritage. Many acts came from the confusions of being a foreigner, while others displayed skills they had learned back in the old country. Vaudeville's attraction to the people was more than simply a series of entertaining sketches. It was a symbol of the cultural diversity of the early 20th century America. Vaudeville was a fusion of centuries-old traditions, including the English music hall, minstrel shows of the antebellum South, and Yiddish theater. Though certainly not free from the prejudices of the time, vaudeville was the earliest entertainment formed across racial and class boundaries. For many, vaudeville was the first exposure to the cultures of people living right down the street. And it is difficult to estimate the number of theaters that played vaudeville acts at any given time between the 1870s and 1930s. There were approximately 8,000 to 1,200 big-time vaudeville houses that more or less maintained a two-show-a-day policy. In addition to recognized vaudeville chains and theaters, there were more than 1,000 other venues that booked vaudeville. On most weekend nights in hundreds of small towns in the South, on the Great Plains, and in the Rocky Mountain states, their shows were put in converted churches, halls, tents, auditoriums, or any space that could accommodate enough folks to make the venture pay. However, as with all good things, vaudeville came to an end. And there were four major factors at play in the decline of vaudeville. First was Hollywood. America found a free and easy way to tap into the variety of entertainment they had looked for in vaudeville through films. And with such specialized skills, the performers continued to perform to smaller and smaller crowds, and in time theaters began to show films. And the few vaudevillians left, some of whom even made their way to Hollywood, continued to perform for smaller and smaller crowds. And in time, theaters began to show films, and vaudevillians began taking what work they could between film reels. This would become even more apparent when, in 1927, sound was added to movies. Another major event in the decline of vaudeville was radio. By the 1930s, many people were staying home and listening to Amos and Andy and Kate Smith. And a third event was the stock market crash of 1929. What little money families could spend on entertainment went for a new radio or cheap movie tickets. There was another reason for the fall of vaudeville, one that sometimes has been ignored or denied. Vaudeville, once the cheeky upstart of show business, had lost its novelty as it grew more polished with the decade. Critics and customers complained that it became too predictable, complacent, hackneyed, and stale. Ironically, though, it is through movies and television that vaudeville eventually left its greatest mark. Nearly every actor at the beginning of the century either performed or visited vaudeville. The silent movie stars, with former vaudevillians such as Burt Williams, Buster Keaton, and Charlie Chaplin, incorporating the animated physical comedy style of the vaudeville stage. Many of the big names in vaudeville went on to become movie and television stars, such as Will Rogers, Bob Hope, Burns and Allen, and Fanny Brice, who, of course, was the gal behind the movie and musical Funny Girl, starring Barbara Streisand. Barbara Brystrand. Come on, I'm better than that. And some remnants of vaudeville can be seen today in variety shows like The Tonight Show and The Late Show, with Jimmy Fallon and that other guy whose name I can never remember, carrying on the legacy. And with that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to let you go now, people. I think that we've learned that even though something may have gone out of fashion, its remnants can be still seen today. With that, I say goodbye and God bless. And also, I'd like to thank the people at pbs.org, vermontvaudeville.com, and britannica.com for the information I used to make this episode.